Hello everyone. Slightly artificial lighting for this video because the daylight is so gloomy outside that I've had to rig up a little bit of a lamp over the top of these figures to illuminate them, so I hope it comes out alright. These are some figures I've just finished painting. They are from Black Tree Designs and they are from their Warriors of Islam range, which comes under their feudal range. And as you can see, they are warriors on camels. Now, I've had them quite a long time. I'm sort of supplementing my major project, which is the Crimean War, just by painting bits and pieces from my lead mountain, just to break up the kind of chore of painting 18mm figures. So these, as I say, are from Black Tree Design. I've probably had them at least 2 years and never got round to painting them. I've got 6 other figures still to paint. I had a whole group of 12, but I thought that would be too much of a task to do. So having now completed these though, I'm really pleased with the way they've turned out. So I'm going to crack on and try and get the other 6 painted and make a unit of 12. But I was tempted to paint them because, as you've probably seen, I tried out a solo game of Soldiers of God recently and thought I'd supplement the figures I've got, and also base them differently, because all my Crusades figures are based individually and I want to base them on multiple basing now in order to play games like Soldiers of God and Hail Caesar and so on. And I'm going to get on to the question of basing in a minute, because Kent Galpin recently on his channel was discussing rebasing figures and what a chore it is and what do people do and what base systems do they employ. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But just to carry on with these figures to begin with. Yeah, Black Tree Design. These are the only figures, apart from the unpainted 6 that I've still got to do, that I've ever purchased, as far as I'm aware, that I've ever purchased from Black Tree Design. They're a really interesting company. They've got, as you can see, I think they're not bad figures. One of the kind of odd things about them, though, is that they are based, or they supply their product with one foot on either side of the Atlantic, as it were. They've got a UK supply and a US supply, but the original company, and I think their home base, is actually in Cornwall, so it's not that far from me. I live in Plymouth. However, they never, again, as far as I'm aware, they never seem to attend shows. I mean, in particular, the wargaming show here in Plymouth that I don't bother to go to anymore. They never seem to turn up even to that, even though it's very close to them. So all their business is really conducted over the internet, and I always had the feeling that their figures were relatively inexpensive, and I've just looked up the price. You basically buy, if you take these figures as an example, you buy them as group packs of 3. These are lightly armoured. They also have a command pack. They have unarmoured spearmen on camels, and they have Arab archers on camels as well as some baggage camels. So they do quite a comprehensive range of Islamic warriors on camels. You buy them in groups of 3, and as I say, I always sort of had that impression that they had a reputation as being quite cost-effective figures. But looking on their website today, a pack of 3 figures, such as three of these figures would cost you £12.83. Now, Perry, which I would argue are superior figures in terms of quality. I mean, these aren't poor quality, don't get me wrong, but I think Perry are probably better. Perry don't really do any, they do a Crusades range, but they don't do any figures on camels other than a drummer, a solitary drummer that comes in a command set. But if you compared the cost of these to Perry's infantry figures, which are in packs of 3 as well, Perry are only £8. Now, there is a certain amount extra lead in these figures. Obviously, the figures are a little bit larger being on camels. But even if you look at Black Tree Designs, Islamic Cavalry, they're £12.83 a pack as well. So, in fact, they compare quite badly to other ranges. Another one would be Foundry. Foundry don't have a Crusades range, but if you took their feudal range, Foundry's a pack of 3, or a blister pack of 3 medieval knights on horseback, for instance, or feudal knights on horseback, would cost you £12. So even that is cheaper than Black Tree Designs. But where Black Tree get this reputation as being very inexpensive is that they are constantly offering discounts and reductions in their prices, but they never, again, as far as I'm aware, and I purchased 3 wargaming magazines, they never seem to advertise in the wargaming press. So you have to be constantly vigilant and keep going to their website in order to see what their offers are. But they are quite generous offers of, say, 40% discount, and they have surplus sort of stock offers, bargain basement type offers and that kind of thing. But you have to be lucky in a way that it's on something that you're interested in. So at the moment, at the time of making this video, their discount seems to be all on infantry figures. So if you wanted to get a set of these today, it would cost you £12.83 plus postage. So basically, Black Tree Design aren't necessarily as inexpensive as their reputation might suggest. In terms of the figures themselves, there is some variation in the mounted warrior. I can see 3 different variations there. There's one that's got a slightly different kind of type of turban. There's one that has the turban raised over the mouth, and there's another one that is looking straight forward, with the beard, the full face exposed. So there's a little bit of variation there. There's variations in the shield. They do, in this group of 6, I've got 4 variants of shield. There's one that has the sort of embossed centre. There's another circular one that has a raised centre and 4 raised sort of projections around that circle. There is another long one, and there is this one here, which is, I believe this one here, I've forgotten the technical name for this type of shield, but it was more prevalent in northern Africa and Spain. And in fact, once the Moors had been driven out of Spain, Spanish infantry did adopt that type of shield. So you see it being carried by conquistador and things like that in Central America. But anyway, so there's variance in the figures, there's variance in the shields, but there is absolutely no variation in the camel. The camel is just one pose. And that applies as well, as far as I can see from illustrations on the website, to all the other types of camelry that I was describing to you earlier. So that would have been nice to have had a variant in the Camel, but it's not a huge problem. I am really pleased with the way these figures turned out, and if I were to increase my army in any way, I would certainly go back to Blacktree and purchase some more of these figures. I think they look really good, and as I say, I'm really excited now about getting on and painting the other 6 that I got. Right, so that's everything on Blacktree design, more or less. But what I wanted to do was kind of just extend this video a little bit, to have a little bit of a ramble. As I say, I decided I was going to base these figures on multiple bases, and I was delaying making up my decision about what I wanted to do, because I basically had 2 options. One would be to put them on a sort of DBX style base, which would be 3 figures on a base that is 60mm wide by 40mm deep. Now, this kind of goes back to another video that I made recently, my wargaming Ramble, where I was talking about how the trend has been in the hobby for 25mm ranges to actually get larger, so that a lot of them are now effectively 28mm scale. And I couldn't really tell you now what a 28mm definition is in terms of ranges and the way they size their figures. I would say these are probably 28mm rather than 25. I'm going to give you a little bit of a comparison in a moment, but my point is that as figures have got larger, it's become increasingly difficult to base 3 figures side by side on a 60mm wide, 40mm deep base, especially as rules that incorporate the sort of DBX standard of basing do tend to be very pernickety about not increasing the base sizes and so on, because it could intentionally or otherwise give you an advantage in the game. Now, I found it impossible to put these figures 3 together on a 60mm wide base. I should have brought a ruler down with me, I'm sorry, apologies for that. But in the end, I found if I put them side to side, their feet, the feet of these figures were rubbing against one another. To my mind, that doesn't look realistic, but even more than that, they barely fit. This is a 50mm square base, and as you can see, they barely fit on a 50mm deep base. On a 40mm deep one, they are overhanging considerably, so it's completely impossible to base 3 camel figures together on a base of that size. And that is, I looked up in Field of Glory, and Camelry are considered to be heavy cavalry, or anyway, there's a requirement that you place 3 figures on a base and not 2. So that made my mind up, and I decided I was going to base them for a game like Hell Caesar. And because I'm actually intending to play Soldiers of God, at least in the short term with these, Soldiers of God isn't too kind of bound to any basing system, so this will make a perfectly good 3 base unit for Soldiers of God, and the largest size unit you can have is 4 bases anyway. And again, with my another favourite set of rules, I have Sword and Spear. They're not too bothered about basing dimensions, so I can play Sword and Spear with these figures as well. So I'm now going to crack on with, as well as my Crimean War project and a couple of other things going on, I've got to crack on with rebasing all my armies for the Crusade period onto multiple bases of this sort of size, and paint up the other six figures that I've got as well. So that'll keep me busy. What I wanted to do though was to show you. I've got out a group of figures. Just have to put these back a little bit. I'm going to have trouble storing these figures as well because they're so tall. I'm not going to be able to get them into the trays that I normally use. The lid won't shut on them, so I have to find another way of basing those. But just as a kind of almost an aside, in the foreground there now, you can see a group of 3 Mongol heavy cavalry that are based on 60mm wide by 40mm deep base. So that is the convention for DBX. So games like DBM, Fog, Armati, that kind of thing. And you can see there they look fine, but the scale of the figures, they're actually, the dimensions of the figures are smaller. These figures are from Steve Barber, and I think it is a huge shame that I quite like those figures. In fact, I really like those figures. Steve Barber don't do Mongols anymore. What a pity. But another thing that I wanted to talk about is spears. Now, a lot of ranges, both Steve Barber and Black Tree Designs, don't supply spears with their figures, but they do supply, or at least Black Tree Design do, separate spears. So that is an added expense. I didn't look up how much they charge for their spears, but the spears that I ended up using, because there are so many companies that don't supply spears in conjunction with the figure, I've got loads of wire spears that I purchased from Gripping Beast, but I wanted to talk about that and just ask really, why is it some companies have spears that come with their figures, others don't? It doesn't make sense to me, particularly for a range of figures such as the Mongols. Now, I used, for these Steve Barber figures, I used some spears that I purchased probably 20 years ago from a company whose name I now forget, who have long since ceased to exist anyway. But you can't, in a lot of cases, just bung on a wire spear onto a figure and hope that it's going to turn out all right. The Mongol spear is a particular case of that. A wire spear on these figures in the foreground just would not do, because the Mongol spear had a particular appearance. In particular, it had a hook on it, which the Mongols would use to pull enemy off of their saddles and so on. And it also had a kind of tassel, I don't know how you describe it. So it looks wrong if you just cut a wire spear down to the appropriate length and stick that in your figure. You have to have a spear of the correct appearance, and that makes it a sort of double offence really, when ranges such as, there are just so many that do it now. Black Tree, as the example in front of you, Gripping Beast often don't supply spears with their figures. Wargames Foundry, it makes it a double offence when the spear had a particular appearance and you can't source it, which is why, I mean, I still to this day probably have about 50 of these spears in a packet ready for when the next time, if ever I get round to painting any more Mongol heavy cavalry. Another classic example is Redoubt and their Zulu Wars range, that they have a really nice figure for a British Lancer. Doesn't come with a spear. And I can remember that a long time ago, so probably that person doesn't even work for Redoubt anymore, but I didn't get upset with him. He got upset with me when I declined. I wanted to see I was at a show at Salute, and I wanted to see what their British Lancers looked like for the Zulu Wars. And when I discovered they didn't come with a spear, I said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to buy any." And he was almost insulted. But the point about the British Lancer's spear at that time is that it was made from bamboo, or the shaft of it was made from bamboo, and it didn't have a smooth, regular appearance. It had all those little knots in it and bumps at intervals that bamboo does, and you could try to kind of make that appearance from your paintwork, but it was unsatisfactory to my mind. And the added irony was that Redoubt have a lovely range of for Wellington in India, and they actually have in that range some Indian cavalry with bamboo lances that come with the lances, so they're not incapable of producing a bamboo lance. So it's very frustrating, I think. Right, so that's two of the things that I wanted to kind of extend this into: basing sizes and spears. But the other, just as a final afterthought or added thing, is that camels, when you're playing a unit of Camelry in Soldiers of God and in Crescent and Cross, for instance, and I think, I don't quote me on this, but I think in Field of Glory and DBM, camels have an advantage, or they have a kind of a buff when pitted against cavalry. It just struck me while I was painting these figures. Why is that? Where is the evidence that horses were particularly spooked by camels? Is it just a wargaming convention or a wargaming supposition? Or is it something that there is actually evidence for in real life, in history? I'm beginning to think it's a bit of a myth. It's a bit of a wargaming myth that has just been introduced in order to make a point to painting camels, because they're an added task. I mean, it's difficult enough for me painting cavalry, but camelry is slightly more difficult again. And if there wasn't a reason for putting a unit of camels onto your wargaming table, then you'd be tempted to say, sod it, I'll paint some cavalry instead, because they have the same result on the tabletop. So just a little thought at the end of the video there. What do people think? Was there a historic case for camels spooking cavalry, them not liking the smell? I think I've heard said in the past, but I mean, to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert on camels or horses, but to my mind, it always appears to me that horses are spooked by just about everything. They're quite nervous creatures, so they could get spooked by camels, but they could get spooked by drums or or anything of that nature, anything, coloured flags being waved in front of their faces, all that sort of thing. So I think it's a bit of a wargaming myth. I'll put that out there as a bit of a contentious proposition for you. Right, okay, that's it. Thanks very much for watching, everyone, and see you on the next video. Bye for now.